The first of the speakers is Barbara Herr Harthorn, who is one of, I have to say, it was so excited, like when I looked at the agenda for today, it's like lots of my favorite people in the whole world, and Barbara is one of them. She's a professor at UC Santa Barbara and is part of a big interdisciplinary center that's joint between UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, Bodega Marine Laboratory, a bunch of other institutions, UTEP in El Paso, that's brought together a wide range of researchers looking at the environmental implications of nanotechnology. And Barbara has been sort of our philosopher guide, rock, steering us through these waters, and a really wonderful social science collaborator for all of us. And again, you can read about her whole bio here, but she's amazing. Here she is.
Okay, no pressure, just have to be amazing. I'm going to read because if I don't read, it will not be 10 minutes, it will be 30 minutes because I love to embellish. So Tim asked me to talk today about an area of research in the risk perception and communication fields known as intuitive toxicology. And as the name sounds, this refers to the processes by which we as human beings and as members of particular social and cultural groups intuitively try to make sense of risk and hazard, with a preference for using our own direct sensory apparatus to see, smell, and taste. Regarding toxics, taste and smell are particularly known as the chemical senses. For example, the smell of rotting food alerts us to potentially dangerous food spoilage, and the taste of contaminated water will similarly alarm us. But we draw on other senses as well. The sight of billowing clouds of smoke can alert us to oncoming toxic exposures. We have highly developed senses, especially we women, yes, scientific evidence, and they can provide us with nuanced analysis, for example, of wine's diverse tastes. I recommend this article. It's an NPR article if you want to pursue that idea further and the gender differences in those capabilities. However, many chemicals, both natural and synthetic, overwhelm our ability to rely on our senses for safety. An example from my own research, agricultural farm workers have concerns about exposure to agricultural chemicals, and in spite of stringent worker safety regulations in California, they're frequently exposed. Farm worker, in fact, the best, arguably the best in the country, nonetheless, daily exposures take place. Farm workers rely on intuitive tox, sight and smell in particular, to protect themselves. For example, they smell agricultural chemicals during direct applications, and they see when the helicopters fly over spraying the fields. However, there's a large body of research that shows that their main source of harm is lower dosage chronic exposures. That cumulative risk assessment that Bernie was talking about earlier, to multiple chemicals, fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, and the main exposure pathway is not from breathing, but rather through their skin. Toxicology came about as a field to provide systematic scientific evidence about chemical hazards and exposure risk, and yet paradoxically, social scientists have noted that the advancement of the science of toxicology, while absolutely vital, has not reduced everyday people's concerns about toxic chemical exposures. In fact, such concerns have escalated greatly. Publics are concerned about the production, use, transportation, and disposal of chemicals. Intuitive toxicology came about as a term and approach to compare scientific expert assessments and lay public risk perceptions about toxic chemicals. So how do lay publics and toxicologists' judgments differ? And most of this work is based on work in the US, I should say. The intuitive toxicology literature has compared US and Canadian publics and toxicologists' views on toxic risks. And so they've done this looking at these four main, there, sorry. these four main aspects of intuitive toxicology, and I'll go through each of those just briefly. So there are some similarities. So this column here is the toxicologists, and this is the public. So this second row here, trust in animal and bacteria studies as proxies for humans. One of the surprising findings out of that body of literature is that toxicologists share public's low confidence in animal studies to serve as good guidance for hazard in humans. They were very surprised at that. On the other hand, differences abound here. So toxicologists were found to think that dose does make the poison, and so they're showing high dose sensitivity in thinking about toxic exposures. Publics, on the other hand, have consistently shown little or no sensitivity to dose. And so that means that they tend to believe that if a toxin is dangerous, if something is a carcinogen, then it's bad at any level of exposure. And so that's a profound difference, except for pharma. So pharmaceuticals, which obviously have many toxic, potentially toxic chemicals in them, there's much more dose sensitivity among publics for that. And so similarly down here, toxicologists have lower risk perception about chemicals, publics much higher. Toxicologists believe that cost-benefit analysis should be done in what you should do about those risk and hazard, and whereas publics think that risk-free options should be pursued regardless of cost. So very different approaches to what to do about them. And why these views differ has been the topic of a great deal of research. Experts tend to base their assessments, their narrow and relatively deep risk assessments, on single source, single instance exposures of relatively pure chemicals in highly controlled experimental settings. We publics tend to take many more variables into account in our judgments. For example, all of these factors have been found in risk perception studies to drive amplification of risk perception among public. And so I'm not going to read all of these, but for example, when people are involuntarily exposed, so think about radiation from Fukushima, versus an X-ray you receive at the clinic, that will drive chemicals that are invisible will drive risk perception, hazards that are poorly understood, and all these other variables make lay people less willing to accept the risks. And I've picked up, working in this interdisciplinary field, I've picked up some of the handy little sayings that toxicologists and ecologists have. So the one that I would say regarding unfamiliarity novel, the frame that is used, which is familiarity breeds consent, I have found very useful. The other ecologist's idea around dose, the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution, capture some of these ideas fairly well. So anthropologists and sociologists have analyzed these responses and argue that it's precisely because we cannot rely on our own senses to literally make sense of toxic risks that our concerns amplify. Having to rely on expert interpretations, esoteric modeling systems, and other complex technologies, think a Geiger counter with an expert interpreting it, means we all have to trust those other intervening judges of risk and safety. Increasingly, trust is harder to come by, and government and industry have often failed to live up to the needs for responsible governance of science and technology to gain the public's trust. So I'm just going to, in my remaining couple minutes, I'm going to show you a couple examples from the work on nanotechnology that we've done, but first just a brief slide to explain that nanotechnologies are a whole suite of new kinds of materials that have many new and exciting characteristics, but also have had many unknowns in terms of their risk characterization. In this slide, now that you have seen the factors that drive risk perception, you can see here that this is a slide from an article that is arguing, it's depicting a young child with a lot of bare skin, so a lot of dermal exposure. It is worrying about unbound nanosilver particles that could go through, penetrate the dermal barriers, and with unknown scientific effects. We know that all of those characteristics amplify concern, and in fact, a lot of people have taken that up. I think I'm going to, because I'm just about out of time, I won't present the data slide here, but essentially we've done, this is survey work based on qualitative work where we interview people to get their mental models about toxins in the environment, and then we model questions, and over 50% on these first 6 questions disagree, and those are what we would call lay toxicology sets of ideas and constructs. Similarly, we have found food, the idea of nanotechnologies in food. This was a survey done in 2007, and you can see that the vast majority of respondents, all but 7, either said they need more information or that they would not accept nano in food. We also found food unacceptable to many people. In fact, in our survey work where we model, this is from qualitative deliberative work, and I won't read it to you, but in survey work we also found that even if we model all beneficial factors contributing, food was unacceptable to large national representative surveys. That food in particular is seen as not conveying benefits, as not adding new needed qualities, and in fact tampering with nature and its connections to food commodification and corporate control. Perfectly acceptable products already exist, so why do this? And so on. We've also looked at the NGO World and its response to nanotechnology. So this is a study of 264 social movement organizations, 107 of which are nano-engaged as opposed to just endorsing other groups. And they have primarily focused on consumer safety and environmental protection issues. But again, their actions have almost entirely been focused on lack of regulatory oversight and lack of toxicological research. So that is where they are pushing in that framework Tim gave you for how citizen action might take place. And mostly none of the public work that we've done focuses on particular engineered nanomaterials. It's really operating at a level of new emerging technologies. And just one last slide to show that experts in this field also disagree. So the point here is that experts are not immune from intuitive toxicology kinds of ideas. We found gender differences. The colored lines are nanoscience and engineer folks, the people actually characterizing the materials, the nanotoxicologists in red, and the nanoregulators in green, showing different levels of risk sensitivity, and also differentiating among products, not necessarily on the basis of their toxicologic properties, but for example, nanoremediation is seen as a more beneficial product, and regardless of what the nanomaterial used. So lay intuitive tox is definitely based on senses, but also on values and ideas about pollution, purity, trust, and a host of other variables. Experts also have biases that take and play in the way they approach the risk characterization. Risk communication, which we don't have time to talk about, is the best available method for mediating these profound differences between publics and experts. And as I think we've already seen today, this really does require a multidisciplinary approach. We all just have pieces of the composite needed to solve this. So thank you.
Questions for all the speakers after them. So our next speaker, continuing on this theme of looking at impacts on consumers, workers, other stakeholders, we have Tenny Adewumi-Gunn, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences, and is working on a project looking at worker exposures in hair salons. I think a really great example of the Center for Occupational Health and students looking at direct impacts on important populations.
Hello. I guess before I start, I want to sort of preface in that I really believe that a lot of the things that we know about the adverse health impacts of chemicals and toxic chemicals really comes from worker studies and workers. And so while I'll be talking about salon workers, I think really thinking about farm workers and pesticides, thinking about sort of oil and gas workers, and also thinking about cleaners, house cleaners, things we know about occupational asthma. So I started this work about 2.5 years ago, working with an organization called Black Women for Wellness. And we did a focus group, and one of the participants was talking about her friends not having fingerprints anymore, her fellow salon workers, and not being able to go to the DMV and put them down. And when I first heard that, I was completely shocked, and I was like, that's not true, that's not correct, that's weird. And actually talking to folks who do nail salon advocacy work, this is a common theme. They've heard things, products so corrosive that they're really damaging to, just general fingertips and fingerprints of workers. So really, really important work to look at the folks who are most impacted with a lot of these chemicals that we are just sort of letting go through. So a little about salon workers. There are about 1.2 million folks employed in the sort of beauty industry, so that includes barbers, nail salon workers. In California, we have about 129,000 nail salon manicurists, 300,000 licensed cosmetologists. In Los Angeles County alone, there's about 60,000. So it's a pretty substantial population of workers, mostly female, of reproductive age. Some salon work tends to be low wage, depending on the area. Areas like Beverly Hills and things like that, a little more pay. And then independent contractors. So salon workers are independent contractors for the most part, often misclassified situations when we look at sort of nail salons where they're saying, these workers are independent contractors when they're actually employees. And that comes into play a lot of times when it's like, whose job is it to educate workers on the impacts of toxic chemicals to their health? And often women of color and immigrant women. And it's really great to sort of watch that video from Chemical Entanglements, and it talks about just how many chemicals we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And so when we look at salon workers, it's, I like to call it this sort of toxic soup, right? They're working with hairsprays, glues, developers, working 8 to 12 hours a day. Really have talked to salon workers who work almost 7 days a week, and really impacted with chemicals like formaldehyde, toluene, styrene. When we talk about fragrance, which is sort of this general term for thousands of different kinds of chemicals, and folks who are really, really impacted on a day-to-day basis with these not enough research. There's always never enough research. But the research we do have when it comes to sort of cosmetologists, hairdressers, looking at dermatitis, and another study just came out 2 days ago finding sort of chronic dermatitis with this population. Asthma, breast cancer, miscarriages, low birth weight babies, really seeing a lot of these adverse health impacts for this specific population. And then I want to talk about, I think we talked a little bit about who is most sort of susceptible, who are our most vulnerable populations, and really talking about how people use the products, sort of these products, right? For example, people put hemorrhoid cream under their eyes for bags, and we don't talk about how people actually are using these products, who's using these products more, and looking particularly at Black women who a lot of the products marketed and used by Black women tend to be the most toxic. And things like hair relaxers, highly corrosive ingredients like lye, potentially endocrine disrupting ingredients, seeing products marketed that have placenta in them. And, when we talk about using products from a very early age, and so you have salon workers who not only use these products on themselves, and so they have these impacts, but also using these products on their clients. And wondering sort of how do we do cumulative risk assessment for this specific population? How do we get data that's accurate? And there's just really a lack of research looking at this specific group. So organization I worked with, Black Women for Wellness, started to ask these questions, really looking at Black women and specifically Black hair salon workers. And for 5 years, collected surveys, went out into the community, and this is when I first started to do sort of community participatory research, and asking people questions, which is for folks, I really encourage doing this sort of community-based research because, one, you have a whole new respect for things like qualitative research. It takes so much just to get a survey, and it's just whole new respect for folks who do that work. But talking to salon workers and really starting to get just some information on what's going on in their health. And we saw things similarly to what we saw in the research and literature: miscarriages, uterine fibroids, respiratory issues, skin irritation, eye irritation. And we saw there was this willingness to try to find alternative products that work, and not being able to find that. Also going and using these sort of tools, and I think we'll talk about the Good Guide and Skin Deep database, but those not having enough information on the products that women of color use, particularly Black women. So lack of access and information there. And then also willingness to spend more and definitely worry over these products. And one of the things we found very interesting is that the salon workers were more concerned about the health of their clients. And so they were sort of talking about, well, how will this impact my client? How will this impact my client's health? And not really sort of thinking about, well, how will this impact your health? Because you see so many clients, and you're also using these products on yourself as well. And so really one of the first folks to publish that information, and we've seen this sort of collaboration of different research groups coming together to sort of ask these questions. And kind of moving forward, and we talked about policy and policy not being enough, and that's why looking at it from sort of policy and regulation, but also education, awareness, and research. And I want to talk about two policies that are going through the California legislature right now, and talked about sort of Assembly Bill 1575, which actually requires labeling of professional salon products. Which there's like this loophole where they do not actually have to be labeled on the container versus like your consumer products. And then Senate Bill 258 that requires ingredient disclosure, also includes fragrance disclosure of cleaning products, which if you like pick up a bottle of, I don't say Windex or something like that, and you look on the back, sometimes it just says water. And we all know that it's just not, it's not water. And so these are two bills that are going through that I think are some good first steps. for us to also as researchers be able to sort of figure out what are in these products to be able to start doing some really good sort of research on them. And then education and awareness. Everyone I talk to wants more information, and it's very interesting as these bills go through, and a lot of the opposition is like, people don't want the information, people don't want to know, you're going to scare them. And it's like, well, people do want to know, right? People want information, they want a way to know, do I really want to use this product? Do I want to bring this product into my home or into my salon? And then training, and talking to salon workers on how to protect themselves. And then increased research on the impact of these products and these chemicals on specifically communities of color. When we look at, what demographic is using these cleaning products more, what demographic is using these hair care products for things that are marketed to women of color around the world. And increased funding and collaboration. I think it's great to see folks from so many different aspects of particularly campus coming together to talk about toxics and impacts on gender and race and class and things like that. And then more research in green chemistry, alternatives, I guess also research more about regrettable substitutions, and we just really need alternatives that work. A lot of these workers know that this may not be the best thing for their health, but it works, and their clients are sort of demanding that, right? Their clients are coming back because, they achieved a result that they wanted to. So really finding alternatives that work. And I just want to really talk about some organizations doing some great things here in California and across the nation and even globally. Black Women for Wellness, the California Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, and then Women's Voices for the Earth, who are all doing some really amazing stuff and just a little piece of a larger sort of, I think we're having an advocacy session later, and some of these folks probably talked a little bit more about the work that they do, but it just requires so much collaboration with research and advocacy and policy to come together. So with that, thank you.